I'm the Brown Booktuber, and today we're going to be talking about Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. So Milk and Honey is a collection of poems by Rupi Kaur, and I believe it was her first breakthrough in terms of having a collection of poems. Rupi Kaur was known as what they call an Instagram poet, so they started off posting their poetry online with like Instagram and other places like Tumblr where it got really famous. And speaking of Tumblr, when I was working in a bookshop when this book came out, what I heard from other people was, this book is Tumblr poetry. You know, it's not poetry, it's Tumblr poetry. And admittedly, I'm not the kind of person that reads poetry all that much. I don't really get it all that much. And so I was like, oh, I guess it's Tumblr poetry. I wasn't going to read it anyway until today, where I was like, you know what, I'm going to get the audiobook of Milk and Honey and listen to it. I also found a copy of the book and scrolled through it as not copy, people reposting the poems essentially whilst I was listening to it. And I have thoughts, and I just want to preface this by saying I think it's both strong and not strong. I think it's in the middle. The good stuff cancels out the bad stuff, and the bad stuff cancels out the good stuff. Not to say that I don't think this is a worthwhile piece of work that isn't deserving of its praise, because it very much is. It's so deserving of its praise, and I want to do such a good job talking about it. I even wrote notes. I never write notes for my videos. So let's get into Milk and Honey, and let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. So before we get into the meat of it, I want to address a couple of things which I think may have affected my experience with the audiobook of Milk and Honey. So one, I think the foreword to this is strong. I think the foreword to this I would much rather have as its own autobiography by Kaur, and I would read that over the Milk and Honey, obviously, and that is mostly because I don't really read poetry. I would rather have an audiobook by Kaur, and by audiobook I mean an autobiography by Kaur, as opposed to just this very short foreword, which was about 10 minutes in listening time. Furthermore, I do think the foreword in itself sets the scene and the tone for the entirety of the book. The foreword is written in a way where it feels like a Tumblr post, and not to be disrespectful, but it feels like it is going for that audience. That's the audience it's going for. And again, I am not that audience. The audience is very clearly, people who are young adults or teenagers who are starting to understand feelings and stuff about love and life, as well as other parts which I think appealed more to me as well, so the very beginning and the very end of the book. But I think the foreword did both. It appealed to people who definitely weren't me, and when it moved through and it started talking about more about Kaur's life and her family in particular, that's what was to me interesting. A lot of the rhetoric and the prose even of the foreword felt very much like less of a foreword which is telling you factual stuff about the book and the author, and more telling you a story. And I guess that's just a different way of doing a foreword. A lot of the time when you read a foreword, it is about the author's life. It is written by someone else a lot of the time, about the author, their experience of the author, the influences on the author. And Kaur does do that, but also it almost is written as if like it's meant to be a narrative piece. So I would actually like an entire autobiography about Kaur's life and family. Secondly, the narration. The narration is by Kaur, and I don't know if I like that very much. It's not the kind of narration I enjoy when I'm listening to something, even if it's poetry. Obviously, it is the author themselves. The author is able to emote how they felt when reading it, and they can emote how the poem is supposed to be read, I suppose. But I feel like at points, the performance of reading is either too influenced by that emotion and personal understanding of the poems, or it feels jazzed up a little bit. It feels like they were trying to get across the poem instead of just embodying the poem. It's very difficult. Like, I don't know how to describe that more so. I remember when I was young, I actually did professional. I did like awards on poetry reading, and at like Lambda and the ESB, I've got certificates somewhere. I probably won't put up pictures of them because, I don't have them with me. But yeah, I just felt like the performance of the poems was took it away a little bit for me. And okay, let me get into the meat of this book, because I think it's been about 5 minutes and I've yet to start talking about the poetry itself. So the poem collection is split up into 4 different parts: the hurting, the loving, the breaking, and the healing. In my opinion, the hurting and the healing are the 2 parts of this poem which I feel like are the strongest of this collection of poems. I think the breaking and the loving, I'm not the audience they are targeted for. They are not things that I enjoy reading or find as interesting as the things spoken about in the hurting and the loving. I also feel like the beginning part, the hurting, is it's wrenching, because I didn't do too much detailed looking into Kaur's life, which I should have done, but the hurting really felt visceral, and it did feel like you could feel the hurt and the pain that Kaur had in the things she was discussing in those poems, and it did lean into the fact that she is South Asian, lent into some of the issues that especially South Asian women face, things that South Asian immigrants and refugees face. And I felt that was really powerful and really strong, and that really hit hard. Again, that is because I have an interest in reading about South Asian history, South Asian people, and South Asian politics. So that might have very much influenced how much I thought well of that part. And that's why I think the first part, in my opinion, is the strongest. And quite honestly, it does touch on themes that are very distressing. Like reading that first part listening to, and the foreword made me really feel like I don't want to dislike this, because I feel like disliking this and saying this is bad is a disservice to the themes addressed in the beginning of this collection of poems. I also feel like because these poems were released about 2016, 2017, I believe, or at least when they came to the forefront and the book was published, I feel like at that point in time, unfortunately, our society was not geared, and it was not ready, and it wasn't prepared to be discussing those kind of issues. I think our society, despite all the horrible stuff that happens in our society still, we have gotten to a point where we are more willing to discuss difficult topics and hear people talking about different topics, and especially hear marginalized or minority groups talking about these topics. Because, as I've discussed when I've read things like White Tears, Brown Scars, the tendency to ignore the perspective of minorities, and especially minority women, is something that is still ongoing, but it has gotten slightly better from the point where this was originally released. And I feel like some of it's like Tumblr criticisms, I feel like aren't as weighty as they were back then. Obviously, this book is generally universally preferred, and the Tumblr things, I think, it might be coming from a little bit more pretentious crowds. They're people who work in bookshops, let's be honest. But yes, I feel like that first section is extremely strong. I also like the very last section, but I'll get more into that. And I think I've talked about the first section enough, and I want to really concentrate on the middle 2 sections quite a bit and kind of understand some of my personal, and again, this is a personal thing, this is my thoughts on it. Please let me know your thoughts down below. If you disagree with me, I definitely want to hear. But my personal thoughts on why I think the middle 2 parts aren't as strong to me. So the middle 2 parts of this collection of poems are the loving and the hurting. And I feel like the loving, at the very least, in my opinion, is the weakest, because it is addressing ideas of relationship and love, and not even love, but there's a lot of sex discussed in that, and it didn't hit as deeply as the other parts of the book did, in particular the beginning and the end. Obviously, sex is an important topic, and it is addressed in the beginning of the book, and I think the beginning collection of poems does paint how you are supposed to see that second section. which I think is good. And I think if you are going to read these poems, I say read them chronologically, not chronologically, but in the way they are given to you through the collection. Do not read them individually because you get less of an impact. I feel like some of the benefit of having that first section read before the second section does enhance the second section, enhances your thoughts of the second section. And I think from a theming perspective, it is better to have had that first section and then address things like sex and love, because you do get an understanding of what Kaur, and I'm going to say it's Kaur's thoughts, and that's not a character, it is the actual, author's thoughts, the poet's thoughts even, that present this idea as to what they are talking about. However, still, I feel like the theme isn't as strong. It leans a little bit too much into the physical aspect of the sex and the effect of the physicality of the sex. Yes, there is the emotional aspect. The sex does have an effect on people and how it makes them feel, but I felt like a little bit too much into the physical zone of it, when there were those glimpses of, no, she wanted to address the emotion and what they felt about it. And I felt like a little bit more leaning towards the emotional aspect of it would have really, to me, driven the themes of the collection home a little bit more. Furthermore, but despite that, I did also feel like both the performance and the poems themselves were weaker than the first collection. Not just from a theme perspective, but from an actual poetry as a form perspective. Again, I am not the kind of person who reads too much poetry. My most analysis on poetry really does come from my performance background of it, and also from my education in English literature. But again, that was very more so weighted in prose and plays. But I felt like the way that Kaur's performing it and really getting into the embodying, the emotion, not the emotion, but like the physicality, the rawness of it. I felt like it kind of took away from the poem. It painted the poems in that little bit more playful way, as opposed to how, if I were reading them, I would read them as more looking at it from the perspective of the first selection of poems, the intensity of them and how they paint that second lot. It felt a little bit too playful, the performance, and I think that also ties into the poems themselves. Some of the poems here I think are lacking compared to the other sections of the book. I feel like some of the poems here almost stray into pop lyrics. They stray a little bit too far into that song-like quality, and I feel like it takes away a little bit from the other very intense themes. And I think maybe it is supposed to be a slightly lighter section of the book, because the rest of it goes a lot deeper as well. But I felt like, and what I wrote here was that it felt very poppy, and it goes into a pop lyric territory compared to the previous section, and after having listened to the rest of the book, compared to the later sections as well. So that's my main criticism of that second point. And the second part of the middle, so the third section, I don't know why I said it like that. The third section, I believe, also suffers from that. Not as bad as the second one. The third section, again, it goes a little bit more into feeling and a little bit more into toxicity from relationships. It goes a little bit more into their own toxicity, their own toxic feelings, and again, the performance of it did almost feel like the character is meant to be jaded a little bit. The character is supposed to be a little bit bitter, but when I was reading it without having the narration, I felt like instead of it being bitter and a little bit jaded, my interpretation of it would have been they're reflecting back on how they felt, and how the way they felt isn't, the best way of isn't the most positive emotion, and that this is reflective of that, as opposed to actually demonstrating those more negative thoughts. But again, I'm not the author, so Kaur probably knows better than me, so her performance is most likely more accurate to what the poem is supposed to be. I guess that's why poems should really be a more subjective and personal thing when you're reading them. But, I listen to the audiobook. The third section does, do a little bit better, though. It recovers towards the end of the section, in my opinion, to hitting more on those serious themes and addressing those serious themes in a way that it feels more hard-hitting, more emotional than the rest of it. And it does lead into the final section. The final section, which is the healing, that final section, I believe, is a little bit more like the first one. It addresses a lot more of the ideas and themes that are in the first section compared to the second and third ones. The fourth section, the healing, talks a lot more about her being a South Asian woman, about South Asians in general, about Sikhism, about seva, the giving without having to receive back. I felt like, again, in my opinion, that was stronger, and again, maybe that's more because I'm the target audience for those kind of poems as opposed to the middle two section of poems that may not be the target audience. And I felt like that fourth section was a very strong way of ending, and I liked that. Although there were certain parts where I was like, okay, well, maybe not as much, like the stuff where she's addressing the reader and talking directly to the reader and talking directly to poets. I didn't, I was like, okay, well, less impactful as when she's talking about South Asian women, about the struggles they face, about how their bodies are not their own. It's something that's at the start and at the end. Again, those are more impactful to me, more hard-hitting, and again, more of the stuff that I read about. I read about politics, identity politics, intersectionality, especially from a South Asian perspective. So to me, yes, that is what appealed to me more, which is why I think the beginning and the end are very strong. If you're like me, someone who's more interested in that, and much more mature than I was at 18 or 19 when these collection first came out. So I think in finally putting off reading / listening to it until my ripe old age of 25 it was beneficial to me, and I feel like I've not read any of the Kaur's work, and I feel like maybe that work has grown as well, but I've not read it, so I can't comment on it. So that's my thoughts on Milk and Honey. I felt like there's some high highs and some, I don't want to say low lows, but sections which didn't appeal to me and may not appeal to other people. I feel like I said a lot of words in this video, and it may take a lot of passing through because, like I said, it's not a book that I want to be saying is bad. They're not poems that I want to be saying are bad, because they're not bad. And it's simply sections of this did not appeal to me. Sections of these poems were clearly not for me. They were for a slightly younger audience, maybe a female audience, or not necessarily, maybe a younger audience that are going through their first understandings of things like love and breakups and healing from them, and maybe an audience that is more seeking out learning and reading about relationships as opposed to learning and reading about what it's like to be South Asian culture, Punjabi in particular, being a Punjabi woman, being a Sikh woman. So that might be where the difference is there for me. If you've read Milk and Honey, if you've read the poems, if you have got your own copy of it, let me know in the comments down below what you think. Again, I feel like I said a lot of words, and a lot more words than I had written down in my notes, but I felt like as I was talking about it, more thoughts came out. So let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. Like, subscribe, share the video with a friend or family member, especially someone who likes the Rupi Kaur poetry. I'd love to know their perspective, even if they absolutely hate every single word I said, if they thought everything that came out of my mouth was absolute rubbish. I want them to tell me that. I want them to let me know. So thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share the video once again, and hey, I hope you read a great book today.